This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Welcome everybody to the second day of the conference. It's my great pleasure to introduce Crispin Wright from the Northern Institute of Philosophy and New York University, who is going to talk about making sense of Faultless Disagreement, the uselessness of relativism, and how to do better. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me. I don't know whether my voice is going to be good enough to hear me at the back. Is this actually no? No. Okay. What's my shot?
Was it good?
I think the acoustics are quite good.
Are they? Right, good. The kind of relativism that's been in vogue, or at least the discussion which has been in vogue recently, is descriptive. The Carlin style of goods is intended as a thesis, a theoretical thesis about the patterns actually assumed by certain areas of discourse. In his view, epistemic modals, descriptions of knowledge, certain kinds of taste, according to Weathers, at least on one attempt, indicative conditionals. All of these are represented as being in some way assessment sensitive. That is, the thought is that their truth value varies as a function of aspects of the agent who is assessing them. And that stress is a descriptive thesis. It stands or falls with the actual patterns in the areas of discourse in question. There's been relatively little direct theoretical attention to the notions that this style of theory needs, of whether there's a coherent package of truth, content, assertion, belief associated with relativistic apparatus. And there's been no attention to the, as it were, traditional domain of relativism, where it functions not as a descriptive thesis, but as a normative thesis. You know, if you say to Gil Harman, who's a relativist about ethics, look, Gil, ethical discourse just doesn't pattern in a McFarlane way, so relativism is a non-starter. He will say, phooey, I don't care. Because my thesis is not about our actual practice, but it's rather about the proper metaphysical conception of the subject matter. So that's my question. Do the materials developed by McFarlane and others recently give us a handle on a framework we can use to readdress those metaphysical issues, to reinstate relativism as a player in the traditional disputes about realism, objectivity, and the rest? And my answer is going to be no. But there is a prima facie appealing thought, and this is what I want to chase a bit. It's this, that there is a distinction to be drawn between areas of discourse where the thoughts expressed are properly seen as representational, and areas of discourse which may pattern indicatively, that is, there may be negation, conditional assertion, attitudinal embedding, and so on, but where the contents concerned are not, properly speaking, viewed as representation. And one proposal about that distinction was in my Truth and Objectivity, where I said that I introduced a notion of what I call cognitive command, where the idea is roughly that you have cognitive command of a discourse where it's a priori. But if there's disagreement, the explanation has to be, in a broad sense, something to do with cognitive shortcoming. And the underlying thought is this, think of it mechanically. You've got a couple of machines that are designed to represent cameras, fax machines, whatever. And you target them on the same circumstance, and they wind up with conflicting representations. Then one or both must have malfunctioned. That's a platitude about the notion of representation. So likewise, think of us as targeted on a certain subject matter. It might be mathematics or physics, and functioning to represent the truths, the facts, in that subject matter. Then if we wind up with conflicting opinions, the explanation has to be that one or both has somehow cognitively malfunctioned, is misrepresented. That needs a lot of work to make that all tight. But it does seem like this, it's like a watershed. If there are regions of discourse where that's not a priori true, that is, we can imagine conflicting opinion, not necessarily disagreement, but even be an actual dispute. but opinions of distinct subjects in conflict. And it's not a priori, given the subject matter, that one or both must somehow cognitively malfunction, in a broad sense. Then it seems we should say we're dealing with contents that are not, strictly speaking, purely representational. And the source of disagreement may lie in the non-representational bits here. Because that's the master thought. Now, I'm not going to try to make that any more exact, but here's where you think that relativism might help. It might help to characterize what's going on, what kind of truth we're dealing in, as we're underneath that threshold, beneath cognitive command. You know, as a discourse where it's not a priori, that divergence involves misrepresentation. So that's the hypothesis. Now here's what I think is a not too far-fetched description of an idea that, according to the folk idea. I do want to stress that I don't see myself as answering to data for doing this stuff. We're not concerned here with linguistic data. I think philosophers are very seldom concerned with linguistic data, even in cases where they might take themselves to be so. I think they're largely concerned with first philosophical reactions, which have a normative status. So, for example, in the Gettier case, the question isn't what would you actually say if such a case arose. The question is, what do you think is the proper use of the notion of knowledge in these circumstances? And if someone says, I think this guy doesn't know, that's something that he has to back up. You might say, well, because he's merely lucky to be right in a certain sense, and then we're off, we're doing philosophy. So often I think the data are actually proto-philosophical opinions. We're already in philosophical space when we get these data. They're not raw material for philosophy. That's my prejudice. I'm not what happens. And so it is here. What I'm calling the folk idea is not a data. It's an idea which I think many of us find initially attractive. Yes, spelled out. And initially it's a combination of three features on the handout. That in certain regions of discourse, I'm now thinking prototypically of very basic taste, say culinary taste, where, at least initially, there is no provision for expertise, and sophistication, and refinement of sensibility. And the old example we used to use was rhubarb. So I have a dispute with Barry. Barry thinks the rhubarb is disgusting. I think it's delicious. This does seem like an area where one of us could be accused of lacking the sophistication of the other, or overlooking certain. You can imagine developing a sensibility of rhubarb, as we have for wine. There's a lot to know, no doubt, about variations in flavour of rhubarb, soil chemistry, and all that. We could do it, but we haven't. And right now, it seems that this is, so to speak, a brute disagreement. But just think about this kind of case. The only thing that's very plausible to say the following. Prima facie, Barry and I are contradicting each other. Our views are incompatible. But neither of us is at fault. It's harsh to say there's a mistake on either side. Well, listen, there has to be a mistake. And moreover, though I guess this is controversial given, or at least the contrast implied by this is controversial given recent literature about peer disagreement, neither of us needs to be dismayed by the other's attitude. Unless you're a resolute, steadfast theorist, as the term is used. In a wide class of cases, when you get into conflict with an epistemic peer, it's rational to diminish your confidence, absent further information. In a paradigm case is a calculation, say restaurant bills, and I get one sum, Barry gets another. We're not far off. You know. But I should lose some confidence in my version of the calculation. Steadfast user, no, you shouldn't. Stick to your guns. It's irrelevant. But my sense is, no, you should lose confidence. There's an issue about where and when and how much confidence you should lose in these cases. But in the basic taste case, it seems to me, there is no issue. I should just be completely undismayed by that disagreement. It doesn't call my opinion into question at all. So three prima facie features. Contradiction, there's genuine tension between the views. Neither need be at fault. There may be a fault, but neither need be at fault. Certainly not a priori it's fault. And the respective opinions are rationally sustainable, absent further information of some kind. Now, our problem is that that combination of views seems to be straightforward and incoherent. And there seems to be a simple proof of that. We look at the simple deduction there. So Barry accepts P, I accept not P. Hypothesis, our disagreement involves no mistake. Assume P. Well, then Barry's guilty of mistake. Contrary to hypothesis, so not P. Then I'm guilty of mistake. So not. There's no mistake. It's a really dumb argument. One feels it's obliterating all the relevant distinctions. But it's a good argument. It's better. There's obviously room for manoeuvre with reductio. What kind of reductio is this? What kind of negation are we working with? We can go around through all these skirmishes. I think this argument doesn't go away. And the relativistic thought is, well, we can block it. If we're relativizing truth, it's an index right under the P, then there's no straightforward transition from P to B is guilty of mistake. Okay. You first have to index P with the B index, as it were. Truth, B truth for B. Okay. And then the contradiction goes away. So on the face of it, the relativist doctrine is a very simple way of stabilizing that combination of views, contradiction, faultlessness, sustainability, against a simple deduction. That's it. And so much for stage setting. So I'm going to argue it does no such thing, but I also want to canvass and try to develop a quite different kind of non-relativistic response in the hope of stabilizing these characterizations of what I'm calling disputes of inclination in another way. So that will be the agenda reasonably clear. There is what I'm calling an intuitionistic response. Don't be put off by the label. It's certainly a non-classical response. I'm using the term intuitionism here to remind you of certain kinds of distinctions that intuitionists like to draw. Whether they can be motivated in this context, in the traditional ways that intuitionists did motivate them, is another issue. So it just, as it were, the shape of an intuitionist response we're talking about. The intuitionist said the following. There's no problem in deriving not 3. That is not yet discomforting. There's no problem in accepting that we can't accept that our disagreement involves no mistake. There's an extra step that we implicitly take when it seems that that's going to give up on the idea of a dispute of inclination. And that is, in effect, a De Morgan step. We go from, it's not the case that Barry is not mistaken, and I'm not mistaken, to the disjunction, so one of us in particular is mistaken. That's a step that's intuitionistically invalid. And that's the step that this proposal says we should resist. To say that it can't be true that neither of us is mistaken is just to say that our opinion is contradictory. But it doesn't follow from that, at least for the intuitionist, of course it follows classically, it doesn't follow from that that there has to be, so to speak, distributively a particular mistake, which one or the other is making. It's an illicit step. So the thought is we do have a genuine contradiction. And that's okay as far as faultlessness is concerned, as long as we're careful about what we understand by that. Things are not in good shape, there is a contradiction. To that extent, things are not faultless. But there's no need to conclude that there is a specific fault on one side or the other, or perhaps both. The distributive step fails. So faultlessness, so qualified, is still in place. And as for sustainability, well, now that I don't have to take on board the thought that there's error here, and it might as well be me, for all I can tell, there's nothing displaying that contradiction. So in blocking the step from 8 to, let's say, 9, the disjunction, it's not represented as 9 on the handout, in blocking that step, we draw the sting, we take the pressure out of the idea that I should weaken my confidence in the face of clear disagreement. Because this contradiction precisely doesn't imply that there has to be a mistake on one side or the other. So prima facie, at least, if we can motivate an intuitionistic proof theory, we can set up contradiction, faultlessness, and sustainability coherently. Later, Ian will speak in tribute to Michael Dummett. I guess I'm already doing that. I mean, the ideas are shining through this talk. Kind of nice. But there's a problem. You see, I don't just want it to be the case that when someone looks at my dispute with Barry, he can coherently think there need be a mistake on neither side in particular. I want to think about Barry that it's good. He need be making a mistake. So from the point of view of those committed to the dispute, those actually involved, it should also be the case that there's faultlessness. Faultlessness shouldn't just be bystander appreciable. It should be antagonist appreciable. We ain't got that, because I am saying he's wrong. I am contradicting his claim. How is that to be reconciled with the suggestion there is no fault? I'm saying what he's saying is false. So what room for maneuver can there be? Surely there has to be fault. In that sense. So there's a fourth constraint we want if we're going to fill up your review, what I'm calling parity, which is that the faultlessness properly characterized should be appreciable both by anybody outside the dispute and by those involved in it. And we haven't yet seen our way at all to sustaining that. Okay. Now let's think about relativism. We've got prospectively 5 different kinds of relativism to review. I'm not sure I'm going to review them all. The question is simple. If we go relativist, if we go McFarlane-style relativist in particular, can we get parity and the other 3? And it all seems obvious, no. We're coming close. It's worth contrasting this style of relativism with a near neighbour, what McFarlane calls, completely unhelpfully, non-indexical contextualism. Something like author relativism might have been a better term. Both these views hold that content is invariant. Both hold the truth value of a given propositional content can be relative to circumstance. They differ only in where the parameter of circumstance is placed. For the McFarlane view, it's with the assessor. It's his taste, or his perspective, or whatever the thing is that counts. For non-indexical contextualism, it's with the author of the opinion, usually the speaker. It may just be a thought. Okay, so author seems a better term to use generically. So here's the difference. When I assess Barry's claim, stewed tripe in bechamel sauce is delicious. Okay. Yes. If I'm McFarlane, I'm constrained to assess it relative to my standards of taste. So I will judge it false. So we're no nearer parity. Since I'm constrained to use my standards, I'm constrained to regard my antagonist in the dispute as mistaken. So absolutely no progress. And a couple of quotes from Paul Bogosian and Mark Richard making this point. I know the point is familiar and obvious, but it's there are some sources for it. But it looks like you might do better with the other one, with author relativism, non-indexical contextualism. Because now, when I assess Barry's view, I'm required to relativize to his standards of taste. So I can regard him as speaking truly. Isn't that just what we wanted? He's right. He speaks the truth. Well, see how comfortable you find this. He's speaking truly. What he's saying is that P, and P is false. That conjunction strikes me as abominable. Certainly doesn't resonate with the ordinary thoughts that feed into the folk idea in the first place. That was part of the deal. But it is a commitment of author relativism. He's speaking truly because when I'm assessing what he says or thinks, I'm constrained to operate with his standards. But then when I reflect on the content, So now it's my thought, like I'm assessing, I use my standards. So it becomes coherent to say, he's thinking truly, he's speaking truly, what he's thinking is the P, and P is false. That's a coherent package. It is a coherent package on this view. I'm not saying, oh, game over. I'm just saying it seems a huge stretch of our ordinary notions. I mean, certain seemingly constitutive patterns of inference are now invalid. X believes that P is true, so X believes falsely, or truly. X believes that P is false, so X believes falsely. These patterns no longer go through. No doubt one can stabilize that, but it doesn't seem like an intuitive reconstruction of what's meant to be an intuitive idea. So I'm discarding it. One can jump off this game at any stage. You may just say, okay, you started off with contradiction, faultlessness, sustainability, you added parity. It's now quite obscure how to stabilize this combination. Maybe it isn't stable. Maybe we should just say, well, the folk idea is confused. That would be a pity. So I'm going to push on. It's worth thinking about a different style of relativism. So Macfarlane and the author of relativistic, actually Max Kerbel, I think, was the first person to give a serious development to that in his book Truth Without Objectivity. The Kerbel style of relativism both up the degree of the truth predicate. There's an extra term in the relation. There's a way of going about this that leaves the truth predicate alone and complicates the domain, the right-hand side of the relation. So you can think of truth as correspondence, simple dyadic correspondence, whatever that is, and still be a relativist if you think that there's some kind of fracture in the domain of the truth components. Kittfine has stuff on tense, which works with this idea. And we can do it with taste. We could think of there being, as it were, worlds of taste. So when Barry speaks, he speaks to his world of taste. And what he says is true, and what he says corresponds to how things are there. And when I speak to my world of taste. And again, it's a question of correspondence to that world. Now we can say that we have contradictory contents, all right. But there is no fault, we can both be right, we're both correctly recording how things stand, respecting our worlds of taste. Certainly no cause, no threat to sustainability. And now I can recognize, as well, the authenticity of what he says, there's parity too. So you seem to get all four features. But what we don't get is disagreement. We've now lost the sense we actually have a dispute. There's a common subject matter, this bone of triton, whatever. We've ordered together and we're now reacting very differently. So again, I keep pushing the ante up, and maybe the effect of doing that is to render the goal unreachable. But we want more than contradiction. We do want some sense of active clash of opinion. There are different ways of developing I say multimundialism, that's a term that Carol Ravane uses. The idea is we multiply the world to which thoughts answer. You could do that on the model of locality. So you might give such an account of weather reports. When I say it's snowing, it's natural. I think most people assume there's some kind of hidden index or constituent of place. But that's not compulsory. Once you have the notion of relativism out there, you can think of this as a complete propositional content. It's snowing. There's no extra parameter that's not explicit. But what there is assessment relativity, or author relativity. You assess it relative to a place. So in a sense, what this kind of relativism offers us is something that's modelled by a conversation on the telephone about the weather in Scotland and New York, respectively. When I'm talking to Ravane, she says, oh, it's crisp and clear. I say it's sunny. The proposition that she affirms is the very proposition that I implicitly deny in saying that it's snowing. There's genuine contradiction, but there's no genuine disagreement. We're articles of different domains. An interesting view, which is worth thinking about, is whether we can't, as to speak, enlarge the domains. These are localities. Can we somehow make them comprehensive in the style of Lewisian worlds, worlds of possibility? So is there a metaphysics of taste where, for each of us, there would be, as it were, a complete world of evaluation? There'd be no locality. My world of taste is a complete world of taste. Barry's is a complete world of taste too. It is as if we were talking across the space of worlds. And Barry was saying, you know, there are talking donkeys here. But I'm saying there are none. I can't talk to you, but we can think our respective. Take Lewis's idea absolutely literally. And consider the opposition of opinion between someone in a possible world, whether are talking donkeys, who thinks that very thought, and I who think there are no such things here. That's your model. So you have genuine contradiction. From a committed intra-world perspective, you have dispute. There's a misunderstanding. Of course, I can't speak across the world. I suppose I could. There's a misunderstanding. I may take it that we disagree. But if you step back, as we're into the Lewisian perspective, and now survey the worlds, then there is sustainability, there is faultlessness. I think that's interesting metaphysically. I think that trying to flesh that idea out might conceivably be illuminating with respect to some ideas we have about taste. But it seems to me the cost of losing the notion of active disagreement is too great. It's not really what we wanted. If we take each other to disagree in those circumstances, we do completely misunderstand, we egregiously, as I said in the handout, misunderstand what's going on. We want a disagreement about this dish in this restaurant where we both sit. And the effect of this way of looking at the matter is to take us out of contact with each other. Okay, well that's all negative. Now let me come to the constructive part, suggestion I want to make. I think we were too hasty. When we said that the intuitionist idea can make nothing of parity, I think that was too fast. It is true that I'm committed to thinking that Barry's view is false. But that's an imputation of fault only if the notion of falsity carries something like its customary normative punch. Now, to see how it might not do so, just consider, as a possible player, a standard deflationary conception of truth, where truth is simply a device of end-quotation, disquotation, an indirect endorsement to the rest. You know the story. Suppose the disagreement is faultless. Then by adding, as it were, the deflationary falsity bracket, Barry thinks something false. I impute no further fault. That gives no extra content. That's just a way of disendorsing his view, and that of course I do. So if our notion of truth were purely deflationary, it would be a mistake to think that the commitment to regarding the antagonist's view as false is a commitment to criticizing it. If there's no such commitment in the original opposition, in the original antagonism, no commitment is generated by the claim that view is false. Not that that's a deflationary notion of falsity. It adds nothing. And that would be a solution. We could just say that. We could just say, yes, contradiction, faultlessness, sustainability, parity is a perfectly coherent package, provided the notion of truth that engages the discourse in question is purely deflationary and carries no normative content. Problem is that no notion of truth, I believe, is purely deflationary. Nothing that genuinely patterns of a notion of truth can be purely deflationary. But again, harking back to another argument, this is in chapter 1 of Truth and Objectivity. But if you think about it, you can see what the worry is. Deflationists vary in what exactly they say. But all of them accept that is constitutive of the notion of truth, that the equivalent schema, or the disquotational schema, let's take the equivalent schema, the propositional one. So the thesis that it's true that P if and only if P. That's the masthead claim, and the project that is to explain all aspects of the use of the notion of truth in terms of that platitude. That follows from that, given what ought to be uncontroversial logical moves, that negation and truth are going to commute as operators. Okay, you think that through. Likewise, tense and truth will commute as operators. So it was the case that it's true that P is true that it was the case that P. It's not the case that it's true that P is true that it's not the case that P. These follow by routine rules. So this truth predicate, whatever its content is, commutes with certain standard constructions. Assertability doesn't so commute. Not given that the discourse meets certain other conditions. For example, it's not assertable that P doesn't give you, it's assertable that not P, in general. Not if there are such things as neutral states of information. And it's assertable that it was the case that P doesn't give you that it was the case that it was assertable. Not if there are such things as additional states of information, gaining information, losing information, and accomplishing defeating states of information. So once we have a discourse where we're up for irrelevant states of information, improved states of information, and the defeat of states of information, think of states of information as what warrants assertion as assertability conditions. Assertability and truth are going to pattern differently. But it's also clear, again, just reflecting on the equivalence schema, it's true that P if and only if P, that truth inherits some of the normativity of assertability. The reason to regard P as true gives you license, travelling across the biconditional, to assert P. So this notion we've introduced, using only deflationary materials, on the one hand seems to be tied to the idea of a reason for assertion or acceptance, but on the other hand has to carry a content that contrasts with assertability, contrasts with merely having reason for assertion or acceptance. It has to be associated somehow with a norm other than simple assertability. It's normative, indeed seems to coincide in positive normative force with assertability. That seems to follow from the materials. Yeah. But it can't be the same. That much seems to be imposed simply by basic materials that one, the deflationists all accept, and two, which are acceptable anyway, as characteristic of the notion of truth. So there isn't any room for a view, at least not without tinkering with the simple logic involved in setting that stuff up formally. There simply isn't any scope for a view that says the truth predicate is simply a device of endorsement, simply a device of commending the assertion of something, commending the acceptance of something. It's got to be doing more than that. So we don't have the option, if that's right, of saying, go through and through deflationist, as far as truth and text discourse is concerned, and you save all those features. That's not going to be an attractive view, it seems to me. So what we have to ask is, okay, how far do we have to, so to speak, inflate the notion of truth beyond a purely deflationary conception in order to accommodate those points? And can we avoid inflating it so far that I wind up criticizing Barry when I say that his view of Stu Tribe is false? To inflate the notions of truth and falsity beyond the purely deflationary, but leave space for a position that says, nevertheless, when I describe his view as false, I offer no criticism of it. Well, to approach that, let's ask a different question. Why on earth, when we're dealing with a subject matter that's acknowledged to have so little objectivity? Taste. Why do we have this objectivized mode of discourse? Predicates that apply to things rather than talking about our responses to it. Why do we have the predicate tasty? Why talk about the food? Why not just describe how it impresses you, the subjective effect that it has on you? What's the function of the objectivized propositional surface, as Blackburn puts it? Why do we have that? Nothing terribly insightful to say about that, except well, the following seems to be the right thing to say first. We do it because we conceive of the subjective response that we have, which gives the a canonical assertability condition for judgment of taste, as something that can be, in certain circumstances, improved on or criticized or rejected. Even with very basic taste, where there's no room for expertise, we may anticipate the possibility of refinement of sensibility, and that might be important. So I don't want to rest everything on my reaction here and now. I want to leave conceptual space for the possibility, but it might be defeated by certain kinds of considerations. We certainly leave room for the possibility of criticism excuse me, by bringing into place other kinds of value. Perhaps more obvious for comedy. I'm tittering away because this old lady has tripped and crashed down on her hip on a banana skin. And you say, that's not funny. It's quite inappropriate to react in that way. It's not so clear with taste that you have that kind of dominance of external value over the value. But maybe we could construct some examples of that too. So, possibility may importantly open a possibility of refinement. We allow for the possibility of exterior criticism from other kinds of evaluation. Okay, bad taste. There's interference, toothpaste, bad cheese. This reaction doesn't count because I cleaned my teeth recently. It's obvious enough. Even where there is so little objectivity, there is provision for a range of defeaters. Okay. Defeaters of the assertion of a taste judgment based on the simple effect of response. Finding yourself sufficiently isolated is such a defeater. I say, gosh, this stuff's delicious. No, looks aghast. Okay, and I'm cowed by that response. I don't go on thinking it's delicious. I think, well, I find it delicious. Perhaps I shouldn't have it. So there's integration to other values, social coordination, possible refinement of sensibility, interference with basic responses. All those are potential sources of defeat. Okay. And an elaborate account, properly elaborated account, would say something about each of them. Develop the story. And I think it then, we'll see the shape of an account that comes into view of why we have the objectified idiom. Okay, well now there's a connection with the thoughts about truth. These materials, in certain circumstances, give us reason to distance ourselves from properly asserted judgments. Effective responses then, judgment is properly made, but we distance ourselves from it for one of these reasons. The way to distance yourself is to say, that's not so, to disagree, to deny. Have our minimal truth predicate to hand, we can say that it's false in those circumstances. So my suggestion is, the story should be the following. We should inflate the notion of truth no further than we need to accommodate the important kinds of defeasibility that operate over the discourse in question, to give us the right kinds of contrast between truth and assertability, by respecting conditions of defeat. That's as far as it needs to go. Now, if we go no further than that, have we crossed the line? Am I now in a position where, in affirming that Barry's judgment is false, I'm bound to be criticizing him? I can't avoid it. No. I'm committed to disagreeing with him, on my own opinion, but I'm not committed to thinking that one of the accepted defeatures must be in play, and enticing me to discount his opinion. That may or may not be true. it needn't be so. And the thought that it needn't be so is exactly the thought that this thought can be false. So the suggestion is that we should go as near to deflationism as we can to accommodate this kind of discourse. We can't go completely deflationist, if those thoughts I put to you about commutativity are right. But we can get close. We can go as close to deflationism as is required only by, with the distance, only such distance as we leave required by acknowledging defeat phenomena. And then it's a contingent matter, whether in a case of disagreement, there has to be a defeater available to one party or the other. It's not a priori, it should be. So there's the possibility of faultlessness. I'm almost done. One last wrinkle. I'm aware this stuff is very problematic. I just want to sketch a shape of view. Somebody might say, well, there's still a problem, isn't there? Because the kinds of regions of discourse you're working in are ones where, unless you're an analog epistemicist, I'm happy to accept that there are bivalence supporting transcendent facts for matter. Unless you think that, you're going to want to say that there's an epistemic constraint that operates over the discourse in general. That the truths about the comic or the tasty or the rest are truths that cannot elude us. They must be apparent to us under the right circumstances. In short, that if something is true in one of these regions, then it's going to be possible to know that it's true. But if that's right, and I recognize that that's right, then in regarding Barry as thinking something false, I regard him as thinking the negation of something that can be known. So aren't I committed now to regarding him as, after all, guilty of cognitive shortcoming? If we don't want evidence transcendent truths about taste, they have to be evidentially constrained. If they're evidentially constrained and you take a view, and someone else takes a contrary view, you are committed to thinking that they're taking their view in contravention of the evidence that's available. That's a cognitive shortcoming. Get out of that. Well, remember we're intuitionists. And that gives us a little bit of room for maneuver. It's not possible, if we reject the epistemicist view, that such a judgment P can be true even though it's impossible to know that it's true. So not possible, bracket, P and not possible to know P, close bracket. What can you get from that intuitionistically? In the way of an epistemic constraint conditional? Well, not if P, then it's possible to know P. What you get is, if P, then it's not impossible to know P. You've got double negation in front of the consequence. Some people at that point will say, come on, what's the distinction? I say, that's the distinction we have to make, if it'll make sense of our thought in this area. We know that classical logic obliterates all kinds of distinctions that initially seem important, not just here, not just in this region. Think about vagueness. Think about Sorites paradox. We can run the paradox in lots of different ways. The standard way is to use a major premise with a universally quantified condition. You've got your Sorites array, and the Sorites premise says, for any element in the series, if it's red, say, so is the successor. That's one way of doing it. But classically, that's equivalent to the claim that there's no element in the series such that it's red and its successor isn't. Those are equivalent claims classically. Intuitively, they seem very different claims. The first looks kind of seductive, but you know they can't be right. It's going to give you a paradox like that. The second also is going to give you a paradox. But it looks absolutely intuitive by dealing with a vague predicate. It's saying that there is no sharp threshold in the series. No last F thing followed by next not F thing. F doesn't come out like that in the series. That claim seems to be absolutely constitutive of vagueness. Of course it can't be, but that's the impression it makes on us. So the second paradox, the one that works with the negative existential premise, is much worse in terms of philosophical challenge posed, because the premise it uses simply seems to be a codification of the vagueness of the title of predicate. In the first case, the conditional premise, that has a certain appeal that it might be supported by philosophical argument, reflection. It doesn't have the same kind of appeal. It doesn't seem to be constitutive of vagueness in the same way. My point is that classically you can't distinguish those thoughts. They shouldn't be the same thought, but classically there's no distinction. I think in general, when you're working with indeterminacy of whatever stripe, or factually defective discourse, if you want to put it like that, classical logic is simply, it's like trying to knit with boxing gloves on. It's too crude. You can't work when you're restricted in this way. Which distinction we should make, how we should motivate and semantic is another issue. I'm using intuitionism simply as a stalking horse. But in this context, we need a distinction between the claim that a certain possibility of knowledge is guaranteed and the negation of the claim that it's excluded. Thank you.
Barry.
Crispin, I think the things you were saying about looking for a certain grade of objectivity for taste is good and is very congenial. I mean, you don't want the epistemicist view that facts about taste are evidence transcendent, nor do you, I think, want the view that all the facts about taste are exhausted by whatever one's getting at the moment. There are, after all, acquired tastes. You know, we didn't all start out liking alcohol, coffee, tea, but we do. So we recognize that possibility, and maybe even for things we find difficult, we realize that we more exposure to other ranges of experience we might revise. So this begins to look like super-assertability. It begins to look like a view in which if something comes within our grasp, and it could be revised, but it turns out not to be revised, then one should hold on to it and maintain it. So there's a sort of degree of confidence one gets at a certain point that, you know, having had enough experience, having refined the tastes, that the other might just be off in making their claims. And that means that, you know, in making claims about taste, you're not claiming that they can't be known, but you're making claims that they might not all be known at once, or they must be knowable eventually, or they must be knowable by at least someone in principle. They've got to be within that constraint. But then the question is, how do you at a time get a firm grip on the idea that you've got all of the range of options in play? And I think somehow or other the closeness of taste to what we're getting, you know, it's happening inside us, it's in our mouths, makes it feel as though all the facts should be revealed. Yeah. But you also need a distinction which you didn't draw, which I think McFarlane doesn't draw and other people miss, between how something tastes and whether we like it. It's very tempting to think if you like it and I don't, it can't taste the same way to you as it does to me, because surely if it tasted the same way to me as it does to you, you wouldn't like it. But why? It could taste exactly the same, and then we have different preferences. You like that taste, I don't like that taste. And if you're going to get objectivity beyond preference, you've got to say it's not just that between these two flavors I prefer this and you prefer the other. You've got to make a claim that they're preferable. And preferable has to again put that outside my inclination or reaction just being localized to me. And it's really quite difficult to locate that element. I think that's the thing that one's after in the sort of slightly normative aspect of taste. That you've got to say, it's not just that that's my preference. We might or might not taste things the same way. Think of acquired taste, the same problem. If I now like the taste of beer and I didn't before, Dennett raised this years ago, does it taste the same? Now there's a sort of paradox. If it tastes the same as it did then, why do I now like it? If it didn't taste that way in the past as it does now. I haven't acquired that taste, I've just got a new taste that I like. So, you know, you've got to somehow find a way to solve that if you're going to get what it is that makes it possible to acquire a taste and think there's a reason to be getting it right.
Yes. I mean, when I wrote Truth and Objectivity, I was thinking of superassertability as available anywhere.
Yeah.
You know, as kind of default truth predicate. And I think that if you apply to Nero test, you do get the kind of thing you've been describing. But I would get squeamish if I didn't know, you know, because when we disagree and I'm committed to regarding what you're saying as false, I don't, I think, want to take on the burden of committing myself to the thought that in the long run, under appropriate education and refinement, it'll be my view that prevails. Okay. To the extent you objectivize the canons of assertability and hence of superassertability in that way, to that extent you raise a doubt about the right to make ordinary assertions based on the canonical response. You're opening a distance. Okay. And it looks like, you know, a claim of superassertability is a bit of a hazardous guess, really, in many cases. Yeah. I'm uncomfortable with that. I give you no argument for rejecting it. I think the view described is certainly a possible view. Do you really want to commit to that as you try?
Well, I think that's the question. You know that there are tastes you acquired. Now you have to have a balance between humility, I might acquire this taste, and enough confidence to know that you think you've exhausted the options, and even with enough trying, you're not going to get there. I think that's a difficult thing to do. But if there's more objectivity than just the subject's response or preference, you better find room to operate there.
Will you grant me this? There may be an aspiration for objectivity.
Yes.
But there can be a population that doesn't share it. But otherwise it makes what we can identify as taste sharpness. Okay. And for them at least, the package that I outlined may be the right descriptive account. So the notion of truth will be much thinner than superassertability in this case. You're making normative claims.
Yeah.
And there's no need to do that. Okay. It may be that it's philosophically motivated to do it. But it shouldn't be a default unless we can make those normative claims. We don't have anything here that's worth regarding as debatable content, truth and falsity and the rest. I want a position that, you know, that can accommodate something less normative than aspiration.
Ian.
Yes, I'm very open to the idea that intuitionistic logic or some other non-classical logic might give us distinctions that we need to draw in order to get a satisfactory description of this sort of case and the others like the ones you mentioned at the end. I think that we're going to need something else which you didn't really provide, namely some sort of explanation of the meaning of the connectives in particular, which is going to explain why that logic in particular is the right one to use when reasoning about whatever the thing in question is. I'd be interested to ask whether you had anything particular in mind by way of such a semantic explanation. The worry is that the obvious candidates don't seem to work. So if you try to do hating semantics here, I don't think it's going to work because the hating semantics, as people know, is to say that you can assert not P when you are in a position to know that you'll never be entitled to assert P. And that will indeed explain why we get weaker than classical logic. But the worry about that in this case is it seems to misrepresent the nature of Barry's acceptance of not P. Barry does believe that he will never be entitled to assert the rhubarb is tasty. But he doesn't just believe that. He believes that rhubarb is not tasty. He has a belief about the tastiness of rhubarb, not about the assertability of the tastiness of rhubarb. Now, of course, there are other sorts of semantic theory which are going to yield intuitionistic logic other than the hating semantics. But I wondered whether you had anything particular in mind.
I wasn't thinking of that particular clause for negation.
Okay.
I mean, maybe this will give us something slightly different, but I prefer to work with a notion of incompatibility as primitive.
Yeah.
So the clause would be something like gamma yield not A just when gamma and A yield absurdities.
Yes.
Okay, where the yielding of absurdity is incompatibility involved in the premise set.
Yes.
Okay. Now, this seems to be true of the notion of negation. We actually work with this kind of discourse.
Yes, but is that going to give you some actual semantics which are going to generate intuitionistic logic?
Well, you and I talked about this before.
Nothing stronger, yes.
It's nice to have semantics for certain purposes. You know, when you've got proposed logic, it's nice to have semantic apparatus in terms of which you can think about completeness and this kind of thing. But I really do think we need more discussion of the thought that we don't really know what we're doing until we're giving a semantic and independent account of the content by formal semantics of some kind.
Yeah. But
maybe you're not resting on their claim.
No. I think something else. I think that you know, most people here are going to start with classical dispositions. You're going to have to tell some story which explains to them why they're wrong to apply the classical law.
Right. So it'll be roughly speaking Huygens style.
Yeah.
We appeal to a common notion of conditions of warranted assertion, and we write the usual clause in terms of that. The clause of negation will be tweaked in the way I'm suggesting.
Okay.
That's the rough frame.
Yes. Right. I'd be interested to know whether the tweaking really did work. But
yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
This kind of a request for information. I just wondered why, towards the end of the talk, we suddenly started talking about truth a lot. Because at a first pass, at least, the initial puzzle that we started out with doesn't seem to involve the notion of truth in any essential way. And the simple deduction doesn't seem to involve the notion of truth. So I was wondering, once we start thinking about how truth functions and we start, what's the relationship between that and the initial puzzle that we started out with?
Well, the simple deduction does involve it's true. I could have formulated using the notion of truth explicitly, and then you would have asked that question. The question, though, is have we in effect just made a problem by bringing additional materials that weren't implicit in the stage setting to begin with? I think the notion of truth is implicit in the idea of mistake, which is appealed to. Okay, we say what a mistake is here. It's thinking what is not the case. That's the notion that's appealed to in the simple deduction. So, in effect, the notion of truth is involved right there.
I see maybe a completely general notion of making a mistake might involve the notion of truth, but in application to any particular dispute between two people, you don't need to invoke the notion of truth in order to cash out what it is for one or other party to that dispute to be making a mistake. A is making a mistake.
What mistake is B making at line 5? You have to cash out the mistake. What's it consistent?
Well, for it to be the case, in order for B to be making a mistake, given that B accepts not P, it would just have to be a case that not P.
Yeah.
I was thinking that's all it would amount to for B to be making a mistake.
How does that help? You haven't used the word true, I grant you. No.
So that's why it was a request for information, was given that there's a version of the simple deduction and a version of the initial problem that doesn't involve the notion of truth, how does the later talk about the nature of truth, deflation and truth predicates and all that, how does that relate to the initial puzzle?
It's a very good question, actually. I'm thinking on my feet about it. I suspect I could have done the second half of the paper without bringing the notion of truth in. Okay. And the discussion will proceed in long terms like this. What we need is a notion of mistake, such that I can say that Barry is making a mistake without impugning any criticism. And how is that to be explained? What notion of mistake is that? Then there'll be the story about different kinds of feasibility, even the very basic taste discourse. So the kinds of mistake where, sure, there's an implied criticism. You're in no position to tell, you just clean your teeth, or you need to more experience of these matters. You know, there are criticisms that can be made, but the point will be that none of those need be engaged. I'm not committed to the possibility of that kind of criticism, simply in taking the contrary view. So the discussion would go on very similar lines, I think. But we could probably dispense with the notion of truth throughout, at least with explicit mention of it. Nothing like that.
Yeah, so I worry that you might be a bit too quick in dismissing the kind of McFarlane line, and especially in dismissing his capacity to account for the four principles. So it seems to me that on that kind of relativist view, one should make a distinction between what is true from the point of view, from the context of the theorist, and what is true from the point of view of the agents. And this can be pushed out, I think, in terms of context of assessment. So it's something that falls well within the realm of the theory. And then it seems to me that one can say that from the point of view of the theorist, indeed the disagreement is faultless, because from the point of view of the theorist who's engaged in a purely descriptive enterprise, there are just no facts about standards of taste or whatever you use to push out talk of tastiness. So the faultlessness intuition is fully vindicated, it seems to me, from the point of view of the theorist. While at the same time, one, as basically is emphasized in the Richard.
Well, we've got to pause. I mean, is the theorist a player? Does he himself provide a value for the relevant parameter?
Well, not while she's doing
Maybe
theory.
you can't help it.
Not while she's doing theory, right? Because she's engaged in a purely descriptive enterprise. And so all that she has to go with are actual descriptive statements.
But
she's
theory,
not taking a
theory is not a
stance.
safe haven.
Sorry?
Theory is not a safe haven in that way.
Well, the theorist is
theorist is bound to be in some state of information. You can't help
forget
it.
about
Okay.
forget
That will
about
or won't
epistemic.
sustain the epistemic modal claim.
Forget about epistemic. I think there are many reasons to think that epistemic models are actually a more complex case. Just if you think about just standards of taste, if you think about normative standards, I think this is basically also what someone like Gibbard, at least in his early work, wants to say, that there is a distinction between what we can say as theorists, right, as expressivist theorists, about what happens when people speak, and you know, we don't want to say that one of them is right or wrong while doing theory and being expressivists, because we cannot. At the same time, it's obvious that as soon as we step into the normative game, we're going to be able to say, we'll be committed to saying, no, that's wrong. What I believe is right, because we're bound somehow by your own standard. I don't see why this idea of making a judgment from a kind of neutral theoretical standpoint is in any way incoherent or even missing.
No, I don't think it's incoherent. It seems to be bad news. Well, the two things are bad news, respectively. One is if the theorist cannot avoid delivering a value for the relevant assessment parameter. So that whether he's theorizing or not, he is committed to a view. Okay. In that case, there's a dislocation between his first order view and his theory. Theoretically, he's saying no fact of the matter. First order, he's saying P. That's not good. That's dissonance.
Sorry, could I comment on that?
Yeah.
Well, the thought is just that if you deny that, then it seems to me that essentially you just blocked the way for almost any form of, non-factualism about these matters, because, clearly at some level we do want to make a claim there's no fact of the matter if we are no factualists, right? But at the same time, we don't want to ditch completely our practice.
You see, I want to improve on their rhetoric, because it seems to be quite illuminating to say there's no fact of the matter. That's the initial intuition. We want to make a distinction of some kind. How do we make it? And try to flesh out the ordinary view is a way of trying to draw the distinction. What's true here that isn't true when we're dealing in robust facts, or these various features, if we can stabilize them. So we're actually trying to give a positive account of that notion, rather than resting on it as a data. There is no fact of the matter. But putting it like that, there is a tension. On the one hand, there's no fact of the matter with a P, so P isn't clearly true. On the other hand, I'm endorsing P. What about? Something has to give there. This proposal is to work out a view such that nothing has to give. Okay? It will be harmony between theory and practice. It would seem to be better if you did.
Correct.
A couple of sort of phenomenological remarks and technical questions as a follow-up. Firstly, I was the oscillation between I and we seems to be pervasive in this. I don't know if it's your argument is there not, in fact, maybe a social ontology lurking in the background here? The technical question here is, what are the, if you go for a hiding style semantics, what is it indexed by? Is it simply, the person's state of knowledge and their future? Or is it perhaps, the set of agreed propositions between groups of people at a certain time? That might, for example, give you.
Good. I don't offer you a view. You can think of assertability for basic judgments of taste purely idiosyncratically.
Yeah.
So the canonical grounds are just how it is with you.
Yes.
Okay. Then we go to coordinated notes.
Yes. Yes.
Or you can be thinking in various ways, where there's an implicit aspiration to coordination and development and convergence.
Yes.
So proper assertability can be something achieved when those things happen.
Mm-hmm.
Initially, they just happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
Our own responsibility is to try and triangulate on the notion. It's that's a substantial question.
Yeah.
What do we want to be set of discourse?
And secondly, about the question of the same taste of equality in intuitionism has a counterpart, which is partners. There is a gap between them. You don't just have equals and not equals. So if you formulate the Dennett problem with those two concepts rather than one, does it go away?
I'm not tracking where that actually engages.
Okay.
No,
I mean, Dennett's problem of saying if I don't like X, but now I like X, has the taste of X changed for me?
Right.
Or not? And there are alternatives between equals and not equals.
Yes.
I mean, of course, you can say the taste is the same. In which case you get one form of Dennett dilemma. Taste then is apart from the taste now. In which case you get the other form, but there is the alternative where you don't have either.
I guess that's right. Yeah. So, I mean, why am I not seeing this as a dilemma? It seems to me to be, to a certain degree, an empirical question. I didn't used to like this stuff. I like it now. What's changed?
Yeah.
Well, you can imagine getting evidence that it's me who's changed.
Yeah.
You've been smoking for 20 years. You damage your taste buds. So it tastes differently to you now. I can imagine getting evidence that I haven't changed at all. I used to adore that stuff, I say. Do you have any? In the goodness eyes, I say so. I remember what it tastes like now. That's quite nostalgic. But I don't understand the previous reaction to it. So one simultaneously get a reminder of the taste, something I've not had for a long time. And I have no sense of it not tasting the same. On the contrary, memories flood back. But my response is not the same. So it's a distinction we can draw in practice. It's not something we draw effectively in every case, of course.
Sana. Okay, so I have a question about the background assumptions. So basically, the contradiction of sustainability and parity. And then the way that the relativist and you sort of proceed to try to come up with a formal account that can accommodate all these. And then if you can, you're like, okay, job done. So don't you feel like what's really missing is still the explanation of what's going on in the discourse from the point of view of the speakers? Like, what are they thinking? What are they aiming to do there? Because, for example, McFarlane, he has, in a sense, he can explain these things, but then ultimately he has this discussion in the disagreement paper where he's like, so why do people go through this kind of weird disputes when they know very well that the other one is speaking the truth, and there is no reason really to try to disagree with them, because you know very well they are saying the truth given their own taste. And then he appeals to something like a Gibardian economy in the end. It's like, well, we try to coordinate with each other. And so isn't this sort of useless to come up with this really fancy semantic machinery if in the end all we want to know is what's going on at the level of thought? What is it that people are really thinking? What are they trying to do? And do you have a good account of all that then matches nicely with this semantic account?
Well, I don't have some of the same, I mean, it's kind of stable that I suggested. I don't have some of the same problems. The father seems to me has the following problem. What am I doing? Venturing a claim. It's one thing to venture a claim on partial evidence, knowing that you're risking the development of evidence that may have returned. Maybe that's life, you know, we have to make that kind of conjecture. But when what may have returned is not new evidence, but a shift in the parameter of assessment, and even one that I can foresee happening, okay, it seems I'd be better to keep mum. You know, why make the claim? I don't know what the father's answer is to that. I mean, he's very well worthy of the worry. I don't think I have a problem like that. I mean, on this view, this is routine declarative exchange. Why do we have such a discourse for taste at all? Is a good question. That wasn't on the agenda, it's too hard for me.
Yeah, but also the way you take the premises as, for example, contradiction. It's not clear that that's how people, as you said, these are the fault philosophical, background premises. But is contradiction really the premise, or is just the impression of disagreement the premise? People feel like they're disagreeing, but that they feel that there's a contradiction of
I think the impression of disagreement because they contradict each other. Because they're integrated. So when you get an account of contradiction that dissolves the impression of disagreement, I say that's a bad result. That's not really enough.
But there's already a lot of assumptions there that somehow this impression of disagreement would have to come down to contradicting context.
I agree that all these claims can be challenged. This is a package of views that seem intuitive. To the extent they're intuitive, they're up for revision and refinement, and maybe you don't want them. While it was only if you want them.
But so do you think that
here's a deal whereby you have them.
Your view makes sense of these discourses, like you have a good account of the thought and aims of the conversation that really sort of explains why people have these discourses?
No, I don't think the view doesn't make sense of that. I think that's a different question. It lets you pose the question sharply. Supposing we really have stabilized these features, you can now ask what purpose does it serve to have a discourse with this kind of minimal truth attitude? Okay, why do we talk that way at all? That's I guess, an evolutionary sociological question. What purpose does it serve? But at least we can put the question now, discourse with these features, as opposed to just some general notion of aesthetic discourse. It doesn't let us actually raise any sharp issues. So I think there's some progress, but not on the questions that you're saying are so interesting.
Okay, so I just want to ask a little bit about this sort of minimal notion of mistake that you introduce at the end. And it's supposed to be a notion of mistake that's stripped of certain objectionable normative commitments. And I'm just curious as to how exactly to formulate what those commitments that we need to get rid of would be. Because you might think that so that there's sort of two related normative notions, a deontic notion and a kind of counterfactual axiological notion. So the first one you could formulate as saying, if S believes P mistakenly, then S ought not to believe P. And that is clearly something that you want to reject in these kind of taste disagreement cases. But the other notion would be something like, if S believes P mistakenly, then if it were the case that S didn't believe P, S would be cognitively better off. Is that something that you think should also be rejected in these cases?
Yes. Cognitively better off, yes.
Okay.
Better off in any respect. That's interesting.
All right, so let's just say better off in any respect.
Okay, because then if you think that coordination is an important function of objective identity, one reason why we put a thought out there, as it were, for common discussion, because we're seeking convergence. Okay. Then insofar as that's an ideal, then we're better off if we converge. So I want to say something about that, about whether that is one of the desiderata that regulates the practice. I think there's evidence that it is. I think evidence that you're in a small, unpersuadable minority is disconcerting. We do receive that. That's worrying, most of us. I don't like it if I find that my judgments of taste, although not objectively criticised by anybody, are very extreme and very eccentric. That's an uncomfortable position to be in.
Yeah, I'm just going to push a bit more on something Sana was talking about. So, and just like how intuitive these four ideas really are. So I know you said they're intuitive, so they're provision, but rather just on how intuitive they are, right? So, and it's sort of inclined to think that even in these like brute cases where you know the sort of the question of expertise isn't really up for grabs. Like, it kind of feels like it varies by case, and sometimes we think sort of in accordance with a contradiction, but then maybe not faultlessness and the others, and sometimes vice versa. So it seems like a lot of the time we do sort of I kind of regard other people's tastes as kind of crazy, right? And other times when they're different from mine, I think other people do that too. You know, have like whole TV shows based around people with crazy food preferences, right? And then other times we kind of think, well, we don't regard them as crazy even though they're different. But then, I mean, then maybe we're sort of more inclined to actually just kind of explicitly relativize the stuff, and we don't think there really is a contradiction. And it feels like we kind of vacillate between those two positions depending on features of the case, rather than it being in any of the cases we necessarily think that all four of these things are. And maybe it's that they seem intuitive, like they might be part of the pro-philosophical thought about it, because you think about some cases where some of them seem true, some cases for others, and so we're putting them, the suggestions maybe they never all really are intuitive about any particular, at once about any particular case.
So on that, when we don't think that we're contradicting each other, what do we think? I mean, on the face of it, you know, syntactically, as it was, a contradiction of what we said.
What kind of?
So, what are they committed to?
Well, kind of just. I mean, people do talk about things occasionally different speech, I think. So that would be the case where actually we do just kind of, although we might still express it in the same way, we're still just thinking it really as it just tastes different to them. That's kind of fine.
I think it's pretty rich in those cases, so in fact, you're intending the proposition this is the
Well, look, it seems to me that, you know, we can easily opt out. You know, we don't like these features, just drop them. Don't contradict each other on matters of text. We're talking about ourselves. The interesting question is, what do we lose if we do that? What expressive power? What function do we lose? That I think is really the issue here. We're in this sort of minimally objective region. Okay, we're even skeptical about the possibility of refinement, as I am rhubarb. What do I lose if we just forget it? Don't talk about rhubarb, talk about yourself. And that seems to me to be the biggest question in the region, because this is essentially the springboard. If we can understand that in the basic case, then we'll be equipped to understand in cases where there's more sophistication, where there's properly setting explanation and justification going into calculus, and perhaps even the moral case. Because all these regions, are cases where the no fact of the matter intuition grabs at least some philosophers and some further. Even when there's great heat in the discussion, as in a basic moral case, intense sense of disagreement, an urgent disagreement needs to be resolved if possible. We don't think we're resonating with the facts. Well, I'm true that we or not. I don't need to have that kind of pretension to understand why I'm engaged in this kind of way. So, true, we can back off the idea of disagreement in the basic case. Not so simple in the moral case. And unless you think the reason why it's not so simple is because there we are actually dealing in robust objective contents. We'll squeeze out the view that says there's no more objectivity, but there is unavoidable intensity. Then we do need to find out whether we can stabilize this combination. And it's just the starting point, perhaps, unfortunately for others.
Well, it's like I wanted to say those cases and cases, so I wasn't thinking that we're going to say in all the basic cases there's not really disagreement. I'd say there was, it's just when there's disagreement, there's not faultlessness and sustainability and parity. So, I mean, because that's what you want all of those to be there in the basic case, right? And then what I say is in the basic cases where there is disagreement, you don't have those features.
Well, I'm not sure I'm quite getting it, because if you allow there is disagreement, and not in some tweaked sense of disagreement, you can't coordinate a project, this kind of stuff. for proper mutual contradiction, or eyeball to eyeball, you're saying P, I'm saying not P. No hidden variables. If we allow that, what is it to let faultlessness go in that case? Isn't that just the problem I was trying to grapple with? I'm saying what you're saying is wrong. How come there be no fault? What do you want to offer? I mean, that was the issue I was trying to engage. How can we combine the idea that I'm literally and clearly contradicting you and committed to my own view without a commitment to the idea that you're mistaken, and hence the fault? My thought was, well, mistaken, but not hence at fault. That's the jump right there, I would challenge. There has to be a notion of mistake that doesn't impugn fault. Maybe you want to do it differently. If you are taking on the same problem, rather than disputing the condition that set it up.
Just our last question.
So I was interested in your discussion of how deflationary we should go with truth. At least part of that, you set up a few different cases, so it's not the case that it was P that you get, it was the case that it's true to P. And you said, with assertion it doesn't quite work out, I agree with you. But then with negation and truth, I mean, there's also potentially a gap there. So if you have, it's not the case that it's true to P, that doesn't, if you're going to allow cases of indeterminacy, then it doesn't mean that you're going to get, it's true that it's not.
Depends what you think indeterminacy is.
Quite. But I just wondered if you did allow that sort of gap, whether it would affect the latter part of your discussion in any way.
Yes, of course. But I think gaps are a last resort here. They're not eliminating. And there's also this worry that, if I'm committed regarding these cases as gappy, what am I doing taking a view? That's this theory practice tension here. Oh, it's a borderline case, or it's a gappy case, he's thinking of the IP, not P. Neither of us is right. Okay, well, that's not comfortable. And if I think that, I should abstain. So I don't think it's helpful. I think that it's not true. It will complicate the argument to that point. But I think that the general thought that we need here to make out, I think, we're a third possibility notion of indeterminacy, and use that to describe what's going on in these disputes. Looks to me it's just going to complicate the terrain and create all kinds of additional difficulties.
Well, it might accommodate something of the intuition that there's no fact in the matter, and then it would be a question of, well, what are we doing when we're making taste judgments?
Given that I recognise there's no fact in the matter, what have I committed to in affirming the judgment?
Well, there might just be another role that you would give to what we're doing in the taste discourse.
But I prefer to work with the notion of indeterminacy. It's just that. It's not a third status. It's indeterminacy as between the two polar stations, truth and falsity. I'm trying to make sense of that. That's kind of interesting in the whole approach.
Okay, we have to really super. Thank you very much for